All right, welcome back to the Fostering Financial Victories podcast. Thanks for joining us again. We got a full house today, so it's the most people we've ever had on in a recording. So I'm excited to be joined by McCreight King, Michelle Seaver, and David Seaver. So thank you guys for joining us. We are going to get into, I think it's going to be a spirited conversation about cost of raising kids and the impact on your financial planning. Where do we start? So the way that we wanted to do this is have it set up to where kind of three different phases. So when you first found out you were having your first child, kind of what were the expectations of what you might be walking into, and then the realities. And the second piece was what happened in reality after you had a child in the house and as you started to see them grow and mature and kind of all the things that went involved in that. So McCreight, you've got 3 girls.
That's right.
You guys have 2 girls. I have 4 kids, 2 girls and 2 boys. So if we just base it on the average cost of raising a kid, there's $2 million of cost sitting at this table for kids. So the average that we have been able to find is somewhere between $175,000 and $330,000 per kid. That's crazy.
They're
right?
definitely worth it though. Sometimes.
Every single day.
I feel the excitement. All right, so the first, when you first had your first child and kind of thinking through, what are some of the thoughts that went through your mind of how is this going to affect our lifestyle?
Well, our first is 20 now.
Okay.
So, that's a long time ago. But I think we were just trying to survive.
Okay.
And it was so day to day, just survival at that point because we were both working. We were paying for childcare, and it was just to get through the day.
Yeah, there was no planning ahead of time. It was just really, like Michelle said, it was, almost like just survive the day and let's get to the next. And didn't really know what to expect. Even from the day she came home,
Right.
much less to 3 years, 5 years down the road, what we were really truly expecting from a cost standpoint, spending standpoint.
We were talking about this earlier. Did you guys ever have that discussion, when you found out you were pregnant with your first child of, hey, what do you think we'll spend on, A, B, and C? It never came up in my house. I can tell you that.
No, I don't think we ever talked about that.
Did you?
No, it never came up. Obviously, the first emotion is you're excited,
Sure.
right? And I think from there, the other emotions kind of rush in too. And you think about it, and I don't think you ever get to the point of like, hey, how much in the scheme of things is this actually going to cost us, right? And so, it was more like, hey, we'll figure it out. We knew we probably wouldn't go out as much or travel as much, but some other expenses would probably come into the picture. Some that you could kind of expect, and others we really had no idea.
I think one of the key things that I always hear from folks when they first have that excitement of, hey, we're having a first child, is they immediately go to, what do we do for saving for college? Like that's kind of the one big item that gets on their mind really quickly. Was that on y'all's mind now that you have one in college?
So we did have someone tell us early on
Right.
to open the college savings account.
Okay.
That was available at the time. It wasn't the 529. It was whatever was before the 529.
Coverdale or probably something like that.
Yeah, I can't remember. It wasn't even a South Carolina plan at the time. And they told us to just put $100 a pay period or a month away.
Okay.
And so we kept that in place and didn't miss it. So that is something that we did do that was, and looking back was really good because you didn't miss it that badly.
Right.
And it turns into something now.
Did you find anything in those first couple of years? I know I'm going through this now with my youngest who's 18 months old. It's, the stuff that you didn't expect to be the big expenses turned out to be that, whether it's childcare or whether it's, heck, diapers at this point, right? So it's, those things that kind of sneak up on you don't really think about early.
We didn't think about the college piece immediately, right? We knew it was there, and yes, that was something. But it was these things just started happening that we didn't think about. I think that was the biggest surprise. It was like, oh man, especially when we had our second kid, it was like, we can't get these kids in the car. Like, and so it's like, we got to get a bigger car. And, you think about the cost of going out and upgrading and getting something that can comfortably accommodate 2 kids. And now we have 3. And we joke now that it's like, we never thought we'd have a Tahoe and still need one of the things on top of the car when we go to the lake for a long weekend. But we're there, right? And so it's those things, obviously housing, thinking you have enough space, and then you find yourself needing to go buy a larger house, right? So I don't, for us, those weren't things that immediately jumped into the scene, but 2-3 years into it, it's like, whoa, these are real things that we have to address.
Kind of adjusting when the madness actually sat in a little bit, right? So, you start thinking about how you prioritize, we talked about earlier, planning and the impact of having kids on planning. How do you approach hey, we've got all these costs with kids now, and the average is, somewhere between $11,000 and $14,000 a year is the cost commitment for raising a child in the U.S. But most people are really focused on saving for retirement, or maybe they should be, or they're kind of balancing that back and forth. So have you guys run into that in the past as far as how do you prioritize? Which one do you focus?
Well, I think right now we're looking at, we're trying to save for retirement. We're trying to continue to save for their education. And then you threw a loophole at me that I thought about, but really wasn't really thinking about. He said, "You've got 2 girls. You've got weddings coming up." I went, "Okay, that was a cost I wasn't really thinking about, but I know that now that's coming up.
You just put a little anxiety.
5 or 10 years down the road." So,
and if your girls are like my girls, you're probably not going to get away with like a budget type wedding either. No. Hopefully, I hope you do, but
We have one that's already planning.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And she just is a little bit out of order on the steps.
Right.
She's a prepper, right?
Yeah. But I think, starting out early, because I think early on, we did a lot of, fly by the seat of our pants. Michelle still did a great job of trying to keep us organized, but still you're just month to month, year to year, just trying to make things work, in real time.
Right.
Rather than truly planning out 5-10 years down the road.
It's kind of like running around with your hair on fire for a little while until you kind of figure it out. Yeah. Survive in advance. Okay. So I think one of the big dilemmas that most families go through if you have 2 working spouses is, what do you do from a child care perspective? If there's a big income disparity between 2 of them, does somebody stay home with the child? Is it worth it? Is it beneficial? Is it more beneficial for both people to be back in the office and kind of working and doing their thing? I don't know if there's a wrong answer or a right answer. I'm sure that you guys have probably seen that a lot in passing with friends and colleagues, but what are y'all's thoughts as far as how people approach that?
Well, I can speak from recent experience because we're in that right now. As a matter of fact, my wife just started working again this week. So she's going back, working a few days a week. She's a nurse. And she works at the pediatric oncology unit at Prisma. So it's a very, can be a very mentally taxing job, right? So, her bad days are always tougher than my bad days. But when we, prior to our first kid, she was working full time. We had 1 kid, she cut back a day. 2 kids, she cut back a little bit more. And then when we had our third, she, essentially was working PRN. So she might work a day or 2 a month. And so, it was a big swing, right, from losing that income and then picking up on top of that some additional daycare expenses. So she would have the kids some, but we would also have them in some formal, daycare type stuff as well too. So it was a very large swing from her working full time, not having daycare expenses, to losing that income and picking up some daycare expenses. And really, like you said, David, you can't really prepare for that. It's an emotional thing. Does she want to stay home? Does she want to go back to work? What can I do in flexibility wise? And it's you can plan as much as possible for those things, but it's really just rolling with the punches and expecting the unexpected. And we've just found a way really just kind of grind through it and make it work. And, now that she's going back a little bit, I'm like, this isn't a bad thing. This isn't a bad thing. But it's just that I haven't found anyone that can say, well, this is exactly what we're going to do, and this is how it's going to work, and we're not going to have any hitches along the way, right?
I think for somebody who's a big planner, that is hard to deal with.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because you always got to be fluid.
Well, and I think there's just a huge emotional piece to it also, speaking from the mom perspective of
Sure.
going back to work. And I mean, we didn't call daycare, we called it school. And it was just something that helped me deal with the fact that our kids were in daycare and I was still working. I think a huge part of it is the support structure that you have. And we are so fortunate that both of our parents lived in Greenville or live in Greenville and have supported us from a perspective of, school called, so-and-so sick. You've got a calendar that you've already got planned out for your day. And what do? Do you drop everything, or do you have an awesome grandparent that can go pick up the child and take care of them?
Oh yeah, definitely a big help.
Yep.
Huge, especially when you see the alternative to folks who maybe moved here from wherever they're from and not have any sort of family support at all. And you can talk about winging it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big difference between being able to go back to work and not going back to work. Because if you don't have that support structure, I don't know how we would have done it.
Sure. So as you guys start to think through with your kids being a little bit older than ours, did you take any certain different approaches when it comes down to teaching them about the fundamentals of managing money, or having that discussion around, hey, these are some helpful hints that might benefit you going forward if you'll take some of this advice? I know my kids are kind of hard to take advice, but yours were a little bit better.
Yeah, and so we give them an allowance,
Okay.
which kind of gives them some parameters around what to work around. But, nobody's perfect, and it's lessons you have to learn. And so they've got to try to figure out how to live within those boundaries. Gas is really expensive, and it changes. And so trying to, work that into, is that part of the allowance? Is it not part of the allowance? I mean, there's all those different pieces that go in. I think there are lessons that are learned through experience.
Yeah, and now with girls being now 17 and 20, one of the things that they've always known, I guess really the last 5 or 10 years, is the value of work. And so the girls have always either had babysitting jobs or found jobs in the summer, to work to earn their own money, their own spending money. Our youngest daughter has really enjoyed working and finding her own spending money and buying things.
So you bring up a great point with the thought of do your kids have a job when they're in this time of life? And so I grew up in the Lowcountry, South Carolina, in a farming family, so that was never an option to not work. Right? It was, hey, you want to go eat, you got to go help around. But the thought there would be when they started working, think about like the 401k world. Well, they're probably not participating in that kind of stuff, summer jobs type of thing. But did you guys ever come up with any sort of savings discussion with them to help incentivize them or give them some sort of motivation on it?
So we have always encouraged them, because they certainly don't need all that money that they make when they're working during the summers, to split it and give 50% to their savings and 50% to their checking. And
Okay.
just to start to build it. And I think they have found, whether it was a trip they were getting ready to go on or, going to college and knowing that they were going to need that extra money, is just having that little nest egg they liked so that they could save up for something that they wanted to do. I know when I was in college, I worked in the summers and saved for spring break. So I had something out there that I wanted to save for, was a great spring break trip. So I think that's worked well for them, as they had something they wanted to save for, and so they put it to the side. And I think that really helps teach them the value of a dollar.
I think that's so neat and so important, right? Because when you tell your kids at a young age, and we're not quite there, we're getting close, they can start to understand money. My oldest, but not tremendously well at this point. But I think that's fun because, for you, that was a big deal for you. That was a big goal. And so you got excited about saving for spring break,
Yeah.
right? And so to teach a kid now and not attach it to some goal or something that they really want, it's hard for them to get it, right? So I think that's fascinating because, what 15 or 18-year-old, when you tell them about saving for retirement or even college for that matter, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, let's like that sounds really fun. But you're like, hey, spring break or maybe a car or something like that, you know, that's gonna allow them to focus in and get serious about it.
Well, whatever it is that's important to them is what you have to kind of focus in on.
Yep.
You know, the 20-year-old's different than the 17-year-old, and you've got to kind of figure out what incents them.
So I think I may already know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Is there a difference between your two girls as far as how they look at that topic? Do you have one that's like the free spender and one that just won't spend a dime?
No,
Okay.
they both like to spend
Yeah,
money.
Okay.
they both like spending money.
They both like spending money.
They like saving it also, like Michelle was saying. They do like the idea of saving some and having a goal to spend that money.
Good.
And just because we think something is ridiculous to purchase, it allows them to make that decision that that's something that's important to them. And so therefore they're going to make that purchase.
Yeah, there have been some things that Dad thought that was absolutely ridiculous to spend that kind of money on something. And Michelle said, David, she saved it. She wanted it. She worked hard for it. I'm like, okay, reward yourself for that then.
Fair enough. Yeah.
So this is kind of in that same realm of questioning, if you will. But yeah, I'm sure when your kids got into the teenage years and you're still teaching, I'm sure there was instances where like, hey, so-and-so got a new car or so-and-so got, all these new clothes. And, so how did you, or was it a struggle to have conversations with your kids about contentment and, not trying to keep up with their other friends and trying to explain that, hey, people's situations are different, things like that. Was that something that you felt like was particularly challenging when your kids were in those teenage years?
I think those are just evolving conversations. I mean, there's always going to be somebody that has more. I don't think they're lacking for much at all.
Right.
But, it's all perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just, there's always going to be somebody that has more.
Sure.
Well, I think that's just society in general. You said perspective, and that kind of brings up a quote I heard, is that nothing is really good or bad unless you can compare it to something else. So it's all on how you look at what your situation is. And, I remember as growing up, there were always the 2 or 3 people who would get the brand new car when they turned 16. I remember thinking, man, that's pretty neat. Pretty neat. I don't know how they do that, but that's pretty neat, All right, so, you guys started talking about savings and as your kids were working, McCreight, you can probably speak to this too, is that one of the big questions that we get when couples come in and they have kids now, and hey, we want to save for our kids, but we're not quite fulfilling the retirement savings either from prioritizing, and they're asking where do we put money for kids? Right, so kind of talk through some of the options, and we'll talk through some of the questions that we always get on that. But you mentioned the college piece. Anything else that you guys ever kind of talk about from a savings standpoint that's not education related with kids and kind of how it relates to them, or is it just more? Was that always the big focus?
I think education was the main thing that there was no other account or something that we tried to plan for and save for.
So let's get into some of these different accounts and we can kind of banter back and forth on the pros and cons, because I think this is one of the big topics that a lot of people will bring up is, well, what do I do? Where do I put money if I'm trying to balance that personal savings for us and then, still got these kids over here that they're pretty expensive.
We've always tried to make sure that we did max out the retirement option of what we could do there.
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's always been taken care of. And I've always been a big fan of paying yourself first, and then whatever's left is what you have to play with. But you've got to get that out of your account as soon as you can so that it's not spendable.
Yeah, take it away from yourself.
Yep.
Take it away.
So the 529, right? So it's gotten a lot of publicity in the last 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
Let's talk through some of the changes. We were talking off camera earlier about some of the adjustments.
Yeah. Well, I think, kind of backing up for a second, like in a perfect world, right, you could say, well, I've got enough money where I can put enough away for retirement and I can fully fund my kids' education. And if there's debt, we can pay that off. The reality is that's usually not what happens, right? We're kind of strapped between what we know we need to do and our ability to do those things financially, right? So a lot of young couples, they might have student debt, things like that. It's like, how do we find that balance between paying off debt saving money for retirement, saving money for kids. One of the things we talk about a lot is, what are your priorities? What's your ring fence goals, right? So what are your 2 or 3 things that are the most important to you as a family? So for some, it might be retirement, right? That might be the number one goal. For some, it might be the education, because they came out of school and maybe they had a lot of debt and they don't want their kids to have to worry about that. So they're like, hey, we're going to do that up here, right? And it's just it's more of an emotional thing. So I think for starters, people have to decide, okay, what are my 2 or 3 priorities inside the ring fence, that if other things come up, like a huge renovation on the house, or we want to put in that pool that we've always dreamed of, is that inside the ring fence? And how is that going to affect the 2 or 3 things that we've decided as a family we want to go after? Not to say you can't go do those things, but it's just understanding the impact that it might have on those other goals, right? So I think it's not easy. And at certain points in our life, we might not be doing all the things we know we need to be doing to achieve the retirement goals, to achieve the education goals. But it's just trying to get a little bit better every year, right? Just trying to get a little bit better. I think that's one thing that's really important, is trying to help, people. And a lot of times people know it's just coming to an agreement as a family or as a couple to decide and kind of prioritize what they want to put their focus on.
So let's say you guys if we back you up 10 years and you're starting to kind of get to this point where your oldest is 10 years old, right? So with college coming up down the road, I'm sure that you guys probably ran into this where, the education piece was the big focus, but there's all this other stuff that goes on with kids, activity-wise. I don't know, were your kids involved in sports and
Yes.
all that stuff?
Yes.
So that's a balancing act,
Yeah.
right? And you probably just need at this point, we just need a taxi cab at my house to take my kids everywhere to go, to get people to the right spot.
I'll give you my daughter's number. She does that kind of work.
Perfect.
She really does.
I will call her. So, I have 3 that play 3 different sports at 3 different times on the same day. So it's one of those things. How do you balance that and all the costs associated with it? The question on the 529 comes up a lot. You mentioned that was one of the first things that you did. It wasn't the 529 at that point, but the education savings account. So recently you started to see where the tax code has kind of lightened a little bit on the accessibility of those dollars. I think most people, when they think about or education savings, it's, well, I'm going to do that. And they don't really realize the restriction that's put on those dollars. So McCreight, talk through that from what some of the changes have been, so that people most people may not even be aware of what you can now do with them.
Right. So a 529, I would say nowadays is the most well-known tool out there in terms of being able to put money away and doing so with the most amount of potential tax advantages, right? So if you live in South Carolina and you open up a South Carolina 529 plan and you put money into it, you're going to get a state tax deduction, roughly 7% of what you put in, right? So there's that upfront savings. There's also the aspect of it is as that money grows year over year, we're not having to pay capital gains on that growth of the money. And then down the line, when we come in to use it, as long as it's for those qualified education expenses, right, we can go in and access that money without having to pay income tax on it down the line. So that's just what makes it, like at a high 30,000 foot view, a very attractive vehicle. But I would say with any type of investment, there's always things from there's pros and cons, right? So one of the questions we get is, well, what if my kid decides that they're going to go a different route, or maybe they're not going to go to college, or, and personally, not to get into personal thoughts and feelings, but, I think there's going to be a lot of changes there. And some people may decide that if college prices keep going up like they have been, that there's other avenues, and that's completely fine. But what happens if we don't use that money for education purposes, right? And we have to come in and pay taxes on it. So, at a high level, it's a great tool. To your point, Eric, there have been a lot of changes where people that have kids and, first grade through high school, private schools, they can actually come in and use up to $10,000 per year in those plans for each kid to cover the cost of education expenses leading up to college. So that was actually a big deal, especially through this. I've seen a lot of folks through this pandemic send their kids to private schools and do things differently.
Yeah.
Right. So we've had a lot of questions recently about, hey, I never thought I'd use this, but I can use it. Right. We're like, yeah, you can use it. So, finding balance between using it now and using it later, it is a very flexible tool. There's certainly other things that people can do. And again, I always say it's about finding balance. If we can have money in more than one bucket, have some in the 529, have some in other types of accounts that maybe we can get to with, down the line without having to worry about using it specifically for education, it's not a bad idea either.
Being in the banking world, I'm assuming that, you probably have seen a lot of bank clients come in from they like these custodial type accounts for kids. Is that still a big thing that you see very often?
We don't really see it as much as we used to. I mean, there's going to be a savings account typically that's a small custodial account, but we don't see them like we used to.
Seems like it's kind of fallen off the favorable ways that people save with some of the restrictions that got placed on those accounts over time. So one strategy that I look back on from my personal experience working as a kid and through high school and college was the biggest regret that I had was not knowing about how to use a Roth IRA as a kid. And when I usually say that to folks, they're like, what are you talking about? That's a retirement account. But the thought there would be, kind of a takeaway is that if your child decides to have a part-time job during the summer or work while they're in school, if they're legitimately getting paid as like a paycheck, they're eligible to fund a Roth. That's a big deal, especially if you take into account that thing can grow for the next 30 or 40 years without ever getting taxed. So, one strategy that I've heard some folks say is from an incentivizing piece is, hey, once they start having a job, I'm going to incentivize them to put money into this. Whatever they save into it, maybe I'll match them up to a certain amount to kind of get that mindset started. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
I think that's a great idea. I love the thought of them starting a nest egg and really understanding that approach.
I've heard that from a couple people. Yeah.
I think so there's two parts of the savings aspect. One is just the discipline of starting something, right? So like I sit down with a lot of young couples that are planning at an early age before they have kids. And I think it's fantastic because, they're building out disciplines in terms of savings. So when they do have kids, they're probably not getting, now they might not be able to save at the same capacity. I'm a prime example of that. But that's okay because it's still even though I'm not saving what I'd like to be right now, there's still a burn there to do it. And that was because it was something that we started doing before we had kids and it became a priority, right? So I think the earlier you start and you form those disciplines, but you also teach them about the magic of compound interest over time and they can see that. The Roth is it's just a great tool. I mean, we talk a lot about being diversified from a tax perspective. It's one of the few tools that down the line when we go to get those dollars out, we're not going to have to pay taxes on it, right? So even our 401ks, great tool.
Yep.
We're going to have to pay taxes on those dollars. So if we've got something there that they started at a young age.
Just think they're basically a no tax bracket.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're not paying any income taxes for the most part.
Right.
So it's tax-free money forever for them.
It's really a great idea.
Unless the IRS changes their mind and says, we're just kidding.
Yeah.
Could happen.
Well, maybe it's a shift that we take. We talked earlier about the girls had a goal. They want to save so much money to spend something. We need to maybe change their mentality a little bit from a spending standpoint to say, hey, let's work on a savings goal also for not just 5 years, but 10 years or save that money to put away each month or each year or whatever.
And I just think had I known about it, sorry, Mom, but had I known about it when I was 15, 16 years old, and at 60 years old, that money has just compounded how many times? I mean, who knows at this point?
Well, David, to your point too, I think those words, they get used, they're interchangeable words, savings and investing.
Yeah.
Right. But it really is fundamentally a difference, right?
Yeah.
Like saving you've got some, goal that's probably more in the short term, right? We're putting money away, but it might be spring break or it might be Going to the national championship game if you're a Clemson fan. Sorry, Michelle.
She's still very supportive of us going.
Yeah, exactly. But then the investing side of it is kind of more long-term in nature, right? Like we're not going to come in and touch these dollars in the next, 1 to 3 to 5 years type things. But yeah, sometimes they get used interchangeably, but trying to help people think about saving money for a certain goal, investing money for the long term. It's kind of an interesting conversation, an interesting thought process.
All right, sorry, I was making notes. So, grandparents, you mentioned them earlier being big and supportive. We get a lot of questions about what can grandparents do from saving for their grandkids. Tell me y'all's experience. Has that been a discussion? Is that a topic that comes up often, or has it ever come up? Not putting them on the spot, but and if so, what was what was the priority of savings?
I think both of our parents have done great jobs of, supplementing or helping our girls buy things, spend things. I mean, they've been great grandparents to, you're going on a trip, here's some money for you.
Sure.
So from a saving standpoint and other planning, I don't think that's necessarily come up a whole lot in conversation.
Yeah, I think the only time I ever really hear it is when you speak with folks and they say, we're going to have our first grandkid and we would like to get somebody started with college education funding. What can we do? And really it kind of comes down to the default setting is the college savings account. I don't know. There's a lot of intricacies within those conversations, though.
Yeah, and I think for us, that wasn't something that we needed. We needed the support network, and that was so important
That makes
for
sense.
us.
That makes total sense.
And we want them to take care of themselves.
Have a little skin in the game for your kids and let grandma and
Well,
granddad do their thing.
My parents, for a while, were having a great time traveling, and Michelle's mom and dad like to get out and go places and do things also. So we didn't want their lifestyle to change to be a burden. I mean,
They need to take care of themselves.
themselves. Yeah,
I got it.
Well, Eric, there's such a dichotomy out there in terms of opinions about that. Like you have some people, and it really is formed by their experiences. Like you have some people that come out of college and they had some debt, and it put a little pressure on them to get in the working world and start making some money and pay that off. And they had a great sense of pride. So they're like, I kind of want my kids to experience that a little bit too. But then you have the other people that are like, hey, I came out, I had a lot of debt and it was a burden and I don't want that for my kids, right? Or I had everything paid for and that was awesome and I want to be able to do the same thing for my kids. And it's just so interesting, right? And I would say there's no right way or wrong way to do it, right? I mean, I think it's formed by what your experience was and where that falls on your priority list. But we get those questions a lot, and I think some people feel bad sometimes because they're like, well, I don't know if I want to pay for all my kids' college. Is that bad? And I'm like, no, I'm not going to tell you that's bad, right? And some are like, hey, I want them to have some debt, but if they did struggle, we could potentially come in and help them out, that sort of thing. Just interesting, the spectrum of opinions.
I would agree with that.
And so David and I are really, really fortunate that we did not come into our relationship with any college debt. Our parents absolutely covered that for us, and that's something that's important to us that we want to cover for our children too.
Yeah.
Yep. Awesome. Yeah. Okay, so we'll switch gears on y'all a little bit. Since you didn't even really know what topic we were going to go through today, you're not going to have had these questions either. So these are 2 questions that we've asked every guest on the show. First thing, financial mistake you made that you learned the most from. And if you don't have one, that's fantastic. You win.
I would say that financial mistake would be just not saving earlier.
Yep.
And I know this isn't supposed to be an advertisement, but I mean, we both walked out of our first Foster meeting and went, why did we wait so long to do this? That, just from trying the survival piece, that we talked about, if somebody had just stopped us and made us go through that earlier, I think our financial picture would look a whole lot different today.
Yeah.
Okay. That has been a very common theme throughout this entire year of folks. It's primarily been the saving early, which is kind of exactly what we've been talking about this whole time. All right. Second one's a little more fun. Last 2 things you spent money on. literally the most two recent things?
Publix.
No.
Is that what you mean? I went to the grocery store last night,
Yeah.
and I went to Office Depot.
I bought a new sandwich yesterday.
All right.
That's great.
Perspective.
Titleist.
There you
Titleist
go.
Smoky Wedge.
Of course.
It was
There you
only
go.
$160. The one I've had for the last 10 years, I paid $25
You
for.
had, you
So
had no grooves left. You had to get a new
Yeah.
one.
And I think the one theme that overarching that I've been able to pull out of this talk is that, have a discussion with your kids and your family and come up with a fun way to teach them about money, to incentivize them to save for something, and to let them see the fun that they can have from a goal setting perspective. I think that's the one thing I took out of this, that hopefully everybody can just do that. If this is applicable to you, great. Anything else that you guys would add from a just kind of overarching theme?
Yeah, I think there's two things. Right? Like, one is never too early to start planning.
Yeah.
Right. So I think a lot of people are kind of getting ready to do that. Right. And so I think it's never too early to start doing something in some capacity. And I would say the second thing, kind of on the coattails of what you said, is if we're not teaching our kids about money, someone else is, or something else is. Right. What they read, what they see, what they hear from their friends. And that goes for a lot of things in life, not just money,
Right.
of course. But, that's, I read that somewhere myself, right? I wish I was smart enough to come up with that, but it really resonated with it. I was like, whoa, okay, I got 3 girls. Hopefully they're going to get those principles and those disciplines from me and not anywhere else, right?
That's good. That's good.
I think the other thing is that everybody goes off the path every so often, and it's okay. Everybody still has time to get back on
Yep.
the right track.
Yes.
And I don't think we should beat ourselves up too bad if we do jump off and just try to survive. But then when we get back on and to get back on track.
I would absolutely agree with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you guys for taking time out of your busy day to come spend some time with us. If you've got questions or you have suggestions or topics that you would like for us to cover on any future episodes, you can find us on our website at Foster Victor WA. You can send us a link directly from that. You can also find us on Instagram at Foster Victor Wealth Advisors. Please subscribe to the podcast so you get notifications on the next episode that comes out, and share it with a friend. We'd much appreciate it. Thanks, guys, for coming.
Yeah, thank
We'll
you.
see you next time.
Enjoyed it.
Information contained in this podcast was intended for general use, not to be used as specific advice. For content tailored to your personal situation, please contact one of our wealth coaches.